for this great day. I'm really excited to be able to talk on a panel about data and social good. And I'll just mention, particularly for the undergrads, the Everett program for technology and social change is a great opportunity to use technology for social good. And so if you're interested, Google it. There's a website that explains it all. And I'll also say that, unfortunately, I have to leave right out after my presentation, so I can't be here for the discussion afterwards, a question and answer. But that's my email. If you have any questions, love to be in touch and share the work that I'm doing. So, data dividends, rethinking work and the commons in the age of big data. This was sparked for me in part on February 12th of this year when, as a surprise to me, the new governor of California, in his State of the State address, as part of the speech said, California's consumers, and there was a lot of talk about privacy and the California Privacy Protection Act that had been just passed, but consumers should also be able to share in the wealth that is created from their data. And so I've asked my team to develop a proposal for a new data dividend for Californians, because we recognize that your data has value and it belongs to you. Now, this is a really intriguing and interesting public policy proposal, and it also raises some really critical questions, both about what is the value of data and how is value created out of data, and how might those of us who provide data, if it is valuable, be properly rewarded for it. And one of the assumptions out of this is that the free services of Facebook and Google and others that we get as part of sharing our data, like maybe free isn't enough. So those are the questions I want to explore a little bit in this brief talk that intersects with some of my own research. And so one of the first questions is, well, how much is your data worth? And the ideas that are circulating in the governor's office actually center more around setting up intermediaries, or essentially unions of data providers who could negotiate with the data users, and so you'd have a bargaining relationship. And so maybe you'd get an incremental micropayment every time you like something on Facebook or every time you do a search on Google. And that's kind of an intriguing and interesting process. But even if it's a bargaining relationship that determines the price of data, how are they going to figure out what's reasonable in that context? Well, one way you can think about it is, well, here's one company, Acxiom. How many people have ever heard of Acxiom before? Oh, nice. This is an intelligent audience on this topic. Well, you know, Acxiom, it's really remarkable to me. In 2017, they could provide up to 3,000 different attributes and scores of 700 million people in the US, Europe, and other regions. By 2018, that had grown to 10,000 different attributes for 2.5 billion consumers all across the globe. And of course, it's all the demographic figures, but your purchasing history and your tendency to like different things and connections on social media platforms. And of course, this is all used by other firms to figure out how they can best market to you. And we now know that Acxiom, at least by the Interpublic group of companies, thinks that their data set, 10,000 attributes for 2.5 billion people, is worth $2.3 billion. So maybe $1 per person for your data. But of course, that's only a fraction of the value of the data, because in the consumer data and in analytics industry, there's many, many, many other companies that use that data to generate other value. And we could talk for a long time about sort of what are the different sections of value out of that. But what I want to say is that the value in the data itself is not the individually provided data. It's the collective insight that emerges from analyzing patterns in that data. And in that context, outliers may be more valuable than the average or common set of patterns. But it's still the collective contribution to that that's the real value in the data. And so what I want to suggest to you is that what happens if we think about data not so much as like a consumer activity, like we're offering something that we should be paid for in a transaction, but think about it as a source of value creation in the economy that might be more similar to doing labor, to doing work, And so every time you like something on Facebook, maybe that's similar to sweeping the floor or making an automobile or whatever else it is. Is generating data work? And that raises the question of well, where are we generating data and how does that happen? Every time you drive with your cell phone on or walk with your cell phone on, that's being captured by your telecommunications company and shared with Google and Waze and others that are showing traffic. Those of you who've seen those CAPTCHA functions online to prove that you're human, you're training machine learning programs and automatic algorithms to get smarter and smarter and smarter. That's adding value in different ways. So those are just a few examples of the many, many ways that we add data to the world. Every time you as students fill out a student evaluation of a class, well, that's data. Should you be paid for that? Interesting question. But of course, much of the value that's created in the economy today is not just in the data itself. It has to do with the nature of the networks that are part of online platforms. So if you think about the difference between MySpace, anybody have a MySpace account? One in the back, yay. So the difference between MySpace and Facebook wasn't necessarily so much that Facebook is that much superior of a software interface. It's the fact that other people are using Facebook as a platform, and so you can connect to others on that platform. And similarly with Uber and Lyft, it's not that drivers are better on Uber and Lyft than the dozens of other ride-sharing companies that started out in that industry. But you tend towards these natural monopolies when you have these network effects where the value of the service that's being provided is the other people that are part of that. And one of my favorite examples of that is WhatsApp, which was purchased by Facebook for $19 billion, and there were 55 employees at the time. That's worth $345 million per employee. And no doubt those were very smart people working for WhatsApp, but their human capital, their labor and knowledge alone was not worth $345 million per people. What Facebook was buying was the 420 million users and the 34 billion messages a day that were sent on WhatsApp at that time and the acceleration in those data going forward. So the data, the value is in the networks and the platform, not just the data. The value is also in the information and knowledge that's embedded in the technologies. That comes in part from literally hundreds of years of scientific research and development that is, at least in theory, collectively inherited by society as a whole. It also comes from major public sector investments, taxpayer dollars, going into fundamental research. And if you look at the iPhone as an example, every major technology that's part of that has its origins, at least in a significant amount, in public sector investments in early stage development. One way to think about this is that this is essentially early stage venture capital at a time when the private sector is not willing to take the risk or invest at a large enough stage in early stage development to fill in that gap. And that's all fine and good if, like venture capitalists, we as a society took the reward that goes along with that risk. But in fact, we don't, because we assume the reward comes back in the form of taxes on income, not assets and wealth. And so in recent decades, we're underinvesting in fundamental research and development and undermining our future because we're not investing in innovation. And so coming back to that issue of, is free services enough? One of the consequences of our current way we treat data and the information and knowledge that comes from that is that we have tremendous insecurity and inequality. Levels of income insecurity, of inequality we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Half the population roughly can't access $400 in an emergency. 92% of people say they would rather have income security and predictability rather than rising income, which contributes to tremendous fear of machine learning and artificial intelligence and a reactive response to these new technology developments rather than, hey, how do we get the human benefits out of it while understanding the risks associated with it? So if we want to do big data for good, I think we have to address the inequality that's part of that, because labor as a proportion of total output, is getting significantly less than it used to. This is a graph that just shows what goes back to workers in the form of wages and salaries as a percentage of the total output of the economy. And it's dropped pretty dramatically. And we have essentially what people are calling a winner-take-all society, where we have a growing monopolization, market concentration, not just in many tech fields, but in many other sectors of the economy, as well as companies take advantage of these network economies. And yet, you know, we all live in a physical world, we all need food, we all need material resources, and we have this tremendous inequality in which, you know, restaurants, food, Starbucks, et cetera, where 1 out of 7 private sector jobs are in that food system, you know, each company gets revenue per employee of under $100,000, where companies like Facebook and Apple might get $1.5 to $2 million per revenue, right? And the key point about that is we're not going to solve these problems in the labor market. We need to solve them in the context of the assets that are produced from big data and technology in a form of a dividend, I think, is a really intriguing way of doing that. So here's the key premise, and then there's one more slide after this, which I think I'm probably out of time. So paid labor is increasingly disconnected from those major sites of value creation and capture, which is coming from data, science, technology, information, and knowledge, in which labor's collective contribution to that economic value is in creating that commons, that common set of resource. And so we need to, I think, move away from our individual contribution, our individualized wage labor system to a certain extent. I think a data dividend is a really difficult idea to implement. And so I've been talking much more about what I think of as a universal technology dividend, recognizing that the value that's created in the economy as a whole is not just from our individual data and the way that's analyzed collectively, but it's from the broader information and knowledge that, of course, is generated from data and has been historically for many, many years. And this notion of the commons and that everyone should benefit in some way from the commons has a long history in this country. Going back to Thomas Paine and his pamphlet Agrarian Justice, where he was talking about land and natural resources, saying that every proprietor owes to the community a ground rent for the land which they use and hold. It's now being explored in terms of climate and the notion of a cap and dividend rather than a cap and trade system. Again, collective inheritance of the sky. Alaska has a permanent fund of recognition of oil. Should be the collective benefit of every resident of Alaska. You could move to Alaska tomorrow, and a year from now, you would get a check at the end of the year for your benefit from oil. And I think we should have a universal technology dividend. And there's many, many people talking about this now, including some of the candidates for president. And the fact that our Governor Newsom is talking about it as a data dividend, I think gives us an opportunity to think about that and really research what is the economic basis for that and how might it be implemented. Thanks for your time and energy. Again, I'm sorry that I have to leave, and please email me if you're interested in any more information.